Great. Okay. Hi, everybody who is joining the Zoom now. As usual, we'll just wait for a couple more people to enter before we get started. You can see we've already got about 30 people on Zoom and about 20 people on YouTube, so that is great. Yeah, we'll just wait a couple of seconds more before we get started. Lovely. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone, for joining today. I'm here with Mark, who has written about the riveting true story that I have read half the book. So I'm really excited for today. So riveting true story about the largest polar rescue mission in history and the desperate race to find the survivors of the glamorous Arctic airship Italia, which crashed near the North Pole in 1928. So before I pass over to Mark here are some reminders about how best to enjoy our live virtual events. Do remember that this event is streamed live through Zoom webinar, both on Zoom and YouTube. Your mics are turned off, but that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. If you have any questions for Mark, write them in the chat on Zoom or in the comments on YouTube, and I'll direct them to Mark at the end. We are going to do a bit of a Q&A at the end, so do get those questions in because it'd be great to have a lot to ask Mark. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to say hi and give your home name in the comments so that we know you're with us today. And that is all from me. So hi, Mark. Thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks, Bex. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
All right. Like I said, I am halfway through your book, and I'm also a history graduate, so I'm absolutely loving it, and I can't wait for our residents and patients to find out about the story of the book. I think you're going to start by telling us a bit of the story. So I will hide my camera and pass over to you.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for having me here. I should warn you, I'm not going to tell the whole story of the book, because after all, I want you to read it. so I'm going to end on the cliffhanger. So the story of Enfield Down. It was published about. It was published about. When was it published? Time goes so quickly. In August 2021, and yeah. So next screen, please. So what was amazing was very quickly we got a review in the Wall Street Journal in print and on paper, and that was perfect. Well, that was brilliant for an author who hadn't been published before. I was a journalist, but I hadn't had a book, so this was fantastic publicity, and that really changed the game in terms of the book. And we've got lots more coverage as well. So it's fantastic I can't believe the journey we've been on, and so it's fantastic we're here now because of that review. Really, carry on, please. Next slide. So a lot of people say to me, where did you get the story from? Well, the story really began in this old book, a second-hand book I got, which says with the Italia to the North Pole by a certain Nobly from 1930. And then when I opened it to discover what was this about, this kind of newspaper cutting fell out, bound for the North Pole, the Italians' big adventure, the first days, thrilling experiences. And that newspaper cutting was from 1928. So this is incredible. The book was from 1930, written, as it turned out, by the person who built and designed and flew this airship. Newspaper cutting was from 1928. And what was weird was it felt so real. It felt like it could have all happened yesterday. The next slide, please, Bex. And then this kind of map fell out at the back, and it had Spitsbergen, on the bottom left. And to me, I don't know whether you like Philip Pullman and his Dark Materials trilogy, but to me, this summed up adventure, high adventure, daring do, political skullduggery, kind of a bit of fantasy maybe. This is exactly what I love, and exactly the kind of films I used to watch. And I thought I have to tell the story. And luckily, a publisher, HarperCollins in New York, agreed with me. Next slide, Bex. So, whereas aeronauts, and I love the word aeronauts or dirigibilists, as in wonderful terms, rather than just kind of pilots, these aeronauts had to kind of travel to Svalbard by ship or by plane, if they were lucky, or even by hot air balloon, I guess. An airship. I was able to fly in a nice, comfortable Boeing up to Svalbard because I didn't know how to start this story. I was stuck. Time was running out. And I suddenly realized I have to go to where the action was. So I flew up to Svalbard, which is about 500 miles south of the North Pole. It's in the Arctic Circle. And when I looked out the window and I saw this stunning landscape, I realized that the book had to be about Svalbard. Svalbard had to be almost like a character in the book. And people who've read the book, tell me that that worked. So do you want the next slide, please? And one of the things that just kind of made an instant impression on me was this huge, epic landscape that really puts you in a place as a human being, and that is Longyearbyen, which is the kind of capital of this archipelago, Norwegian archipelago, and you can see how totally dwarfed it is by these mountains. And it also kind of, there's also a sense of majesty, there's a sense of escape. You know, when I had tough times reading the book, I kind of wanted to get back to this kind of pure space. And this also gives you a sense of the the kind of bravery, the foolhardiness of these kind of early aviators who were going into this wilderness, often in planes they haven't really tested, and airships they hadn't really tested. They didn't know what was going to happen, and they didn't know what they was going to find, and they were risking their life. There was no health and safety checks or paperwork. I mean, they were incredibly brave. And I just had to write the story. Next slide. Okay, so there's two men really at the centre of the story who are polar opposites. You have Roald Amundsen, who we've probably heard of. He is a guy who beat, obviously Scott to the Antarctic, but he did more than that. He led the first expedition through the Northwest Passage when he was called the Chief. He was a ruthless competitor. He outfoxed Scott to get to the South Pole. I mean, he did so much in over the 3 decades he was alive or more than we probably would achieve in many lifetimes. And he lived through so many different epochs before the First World War, the 20s. It's really hard to imagine the same guy who was going through the Northwest Passage in 1904-05 was, in Svalbard in 1928 flying planes. And that's the incredible thing about him. He was, in his last years, he was an aviation pioneer. He realized that aircraft could revolutionize exploration, make it so much easier, because you could obviously travel in an hour over landscapes that would take you, days and weeks to cross. Next slide, please. So here's the other guy in the story, and they are polar opposites. This is Umberto Nobili. He's an Italian, really genius airship designer and engineer. He's descended from Italian aristocracy. He lived in southern Mediterranean. Amundsen, struggled to have long-term relationships with women. He went from mistress to mistress. Nobody had a wife, a child. Totally polar opposites. And also, he had a dog that Amundsen couldn't stand, Titania. For Amundsen, a real dog is a husky. He was really useful in the snow, and then you can eat it. If you're in desperation. But with Titania, she didn't do anything really, and Amundsen thought you couldn't really eat her either. There wasn't much on her. So they're really two different characters, but they're going to be thrown together, in the next few years in the bid to explore the North Pole by air. And they're very different people. Amundsen was used to be called the Chief. He had a very dictatorial leadership style. Nobly also, was charismatic. And he had his Italian crew on board along with the Norwegians. So straight away you had the split that Amundsen always thought was going to lead to disaster in expeditions. Yes, thank you, Melanie. I will speak a bit slower. Cool. Could you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so Amundsen and Nobly were going to the North Pole, but Nobly was backed by this delightful chap in the middle, who hopefully we all recognize is Benito Mussolini, the dictator of Italy. So when Amundsen kind of brought Nobly's airship and agreed to have Nobly as a kind of captain, as one of the partners, the expedition was Amundsen Ellsworth Nobly expedition. I don't think he realized how much he was going to have to deal with Mussolini, or what Mussolini's plans were. Mussolini had just taken over Italy on the march from Rome, a bit like Donald Trump's march on Washington. He's establishing his dictatorship, and he saw aviation as the way to kind of prove his regime, prove that the success of his regime. to the world, and also to the many Italian people who lived and emigrated to kind of America, Brazil, Australia. So it's a real. He saw this as a real propaganda exercise for for Italy. And I don't think Amundsen really understood this. And then next to Mussolini on my right, I guess, is a younger man with a kind of a goatee. And that was a guy called Italia Balbo, and he turns into one of the real villains of the story because, I mean, he's a ruthless street fighter. He was one of the founders of the fascist party. He was a pilot. He was an explorer himself, and he wanted to modernize the Italian Air Force. And he didn't think airships and nobody had any place in it. And he had a famous phrase, there's no room for prima donnas in the Italian Air Force, and he seemed to be looking directly at nobody when he said it. So Amundsen does the still for the airship. Nobody's going to be the captain. Nobody's going to it's going to be named after him. It's going to be a joint expedition. He's backed by Mussolini and Balbo, but they're going to want to pay out from this expedition, and nobody obviously has to watch his back as well, because if he fails, the outcome is probably not going to be very good for him. Next slide, please. Okay, so I thought I'd show you this map because it's very hard for us to understand what was motivating these people. 1928, the book seems really modern, the newspaper extract seems very modern, but actually, as I researched the story, I realized how many aspects of their life are so alien. And one of this is this belief that on the other side of the North Pole, which hopefully you can see on the slide, there is this perhaps a lost continent, a warm sea. Even some people believed kind of an entrance to the hollow Earth, which came out in Antarctica. But certainly there was this unexplored area. No one knew what was there, and it's incredible to us today that people, kind of semi-believed or still believed that there could be this continent there. So what they wanted to do was discover this land, and obviously this is a high day of imperialism, and obviously if you discover this land, you want to claim it for your country. But the problem is, in lots of the expeditions we'll see, is that there's lots of different nations involved. So who was going to claim this land? Norway, Amundsen's Norway, Italy, Mussolini's Italy. So straight away you've got this conflict over going on in the background as well. And also for the Norwegians, they felt they missed out on their empire building of the other European nations because they'd been part of Sweden, and they saw this as their chance to build an empire of the ice and snow in Antarctica. Sorry, in the Arctic. And again, and I thought I'd put this up as well. It shows you from the New York Times, all these cuttings of the New York Times, just to show you how big these stories were. We've totally forgotten these stories, but they were very big stories at the time. So this is March 1926. Mass attack on the polar region begins soon. 10 expeditions will probably go to the frozen north this summer. Explorers hope to find a new continent. So again, you've got this idea of a new continent in the New York Times. So this is what's at stake for the men as we head towards the mid-1920s. Next slide, please, Lex. So the story really begins with Amundsen. Amundsen obviously lived at the hardest, toughest, worked and survived and journeyed through the hardest, most extreme climates on Earth. But when he wasn't there, he liked a luxury hotel, and you can't really blame him. So this is the Waldorf Astoria in New York, and it comes to 1924. We find him in here, locked in his room. The creditors are banging on his door, putting bills underneath. And he's broke. He's washed up. He's towards the end of his career. He hasn't got many more expeditions in him, and he uses these expeditions to earn money through lectures and book sales and articles and sponsorship. He hasn't got many more expeditions in him. He's run out of money. He's not very good with his money. That's another thing to remember about Amundsen. And he's washed up. And then this millionaire, Lincoln Ellsworth, comes along and says, he's actually in the lobby of the hotel, rings up and says, can I speak to you, Amundsen? And he's saved because Ellsworth worships Amundsen and is going to kind of bankroll his expeditions. Next slide, please. So the first attempt Amundsen makes to fly to North Pole is in 1925 in these state-of-the-art German flying boats, which are perfect designed for these extreme conditions with a kind of metal hull. And so they fly in May 1925. They leave from Svalbard in this kind of northwest corner called Kings Bay, where lots of these expeditions leave from. And they're going to fly 500 miles to the North Pole and back again and be the first people to get there before all these other expeditions make it. Because Amundsen's in a race against time. There's no point in the explorer business being second or third. So they set off and they disappear. And no one, and they don't come back. It's about 8 hours to the North Pole, 8 hours back. They don't come back. He leaves too soon to take a radio. He doesn't want to wait for a radio. He didn't even test the planes. So no one knows what's happened to him. And also Amundsen has had a habit of disappearing on expeditions before, perhaps, if you're cynical, to increase kind of newspaper sales, increase the value of his stories when he gets out. So no one knows what's happened to them, but tragically, potentially tragically for them, they had to land. And their petrol problem was one of the planes got written off after they landed in the sea ice, which is very unstable, and there's gaps where you can land, but the ice kind of moves in very quickly. So they crashed on the ice. They've got one plane left that can just about take all the men off, but they have to build a runway. And he didn't take any tools with him either to build anything, so they have to make do. And this is brutal. They've got about over 3 weeks. They have to carve this runway out of the ice, and the sea ice is obviously changing, and it regularly destroys the runway they've built. And Lincoln Ellsworth, who's a millionaire who's funding it, he has some great quotes that you can sense. You can sense the tension that they're under. He writes, "In the utter silence, this seemed to me to be the kingdom of death." And as the food was running out, and as they tried to take off, and they only had so much fuel left, he said, "Men fight for their lives to the last inch," and they certainly did. So they had enough fuel left for one last flight. The only other option is to walk out over the sea ice, which is technically possible, 500 miles back to Svalbard or perhaps to Greenland, but it's a nightmare. The ice is, you can't tell how the thickness of the ice, people will be plunged into it at a moment's notice. It's a brutal way to try and escape. You almost, sometimes explorers talk about walking on their hands and knees, and it's probably their death warrant. So this was their one last flight, and they got off the ice, which was fantastic. When the plane ran out of fuel and landed near Svalbard, near Kings Bay, a whaler came up to them in the ship and said to Amundsen, "You're supposed to be dead." So this helps build Amundsen's legend as this immortal man that he will never be defeated. Next slide, please, Bex. And here we go. Amundsen back safe in Spitsbergen. Planes landed at 150 miles from the pole, maybe being a bit shorter to force to return. And you can see again that unexplored area that they're very keen, and Spitsbergen on the right. Okay, next slide, please. So the lesson Amundsen takes on this is fixed wing aircraft is not the way to go, So we're going to go in an airship, which seems incredible to us now, but at the time it seemed to be rivaling planes as a future of aviation. So German Zeppelins, great passenger flying Zeppelins were being built. The British were thinking about building theirs. The Americans were thinking about building theirs. People thought the future of transport was the airship, the Zeppelin. And here's the one that they decided to fly to the North Pole. Next slide, please. Cool, thanks. So there's a video, here we go. Thank you, Bex. If it works. All these things worked in practice.
I have clicked play, it just, I think it's loading very slowly.
Yeah. But yes, so this is to get to the North Pole, flying all the way from Italy to Svalbard was a rather too long journey. So what they did was dogleg it. So they're going to fly from Rome to Pullen in Norfolk, which we've forgotten about now, but at the time was this massive airship base, equivalent to Cape Canaveral, because they're testing all this new technology, and then to St. Petersburg, and then to Svalbard. So if this video had worked, it was a picture of the Norge.
No, the presentation has just crashed, I think, because of the video. So I'm just going to reload those. If you could keep chatting,
Okay.
Mark, and I will
Okay. Yes.
start the
Yes.
presentation up when I can.
That's okay. Yes. So they had to fly to Fulham in Norfolk, uh, and if you go there now, Fulham is just kind of this kind of grassy fields. There's a few concrete foundations left from those days, but this was a vast base with hundreds of people working on there, and then then onwards to North Pole. And if you can see the film, there's this amazing footage of the airship uh, traveling over the fields of England. Uh, and also being filmed from the Pathé News biplane. So you've got the sense of, I think this is a key thing to the whole story, is that these explorers weren't just doing this for fun, this was their business. And one of the ways they made money, and one of the ways Mussolini was going to have his propaganda triumph was by making sure it was all filmed by the kind of newsreels, by the newspaper photographers, and that could get out very quickly. Within 24 hours, photographs to get out. The newspaper stories could be released. So the whole world would know very, very soon. It's not like Scott and Amundsen's day in Antarctica when news took a long time to get out. It's almost people were experiencing for the first time these adventures. I mean, it's almost in real time. You know, certainly within a day or some of these things happening, if not a lot sooner. So where were they trying to get to? So they were trying to get to this place called Kings Bay, as it says on the picture. We think of the Arctic and Svalbard and the pictures I showed you earlier, well, this pristine wilderness, but actually Svalbard had a key industry in 1926, and that's coal mining. We don't think about coal coming from the Arctic Circle, but it did. And this was the Kings Bay coal mine. You can see the piles of coal, the miners' cottages, this bit of kind of grim kind of industrialization in the middle of this kind of paradise, Arctic kind of paradise. And then on the left is a strange structure, which is this amazing hangar. Do you want the next picture, please? This amazing hangar you can see here. So this hangar, because I mean, this airship, nobody's airships were the size of, an A380, a jumbo jet. So they're huge machines, and they would get destroyed in the Arctic very quickly, especially the terrible storms that get whipped up. So even though they were going to spend a day or two in Svalbard, you had to protect it. So what they did, it's an amazing feat. I wrote about this for the BBC, so it's worth checking, Googling that. And it's been totally forgotten, is over the Arctic winter, the Italian craftsmen, who also used to the warmth of the Mediterranean, came up, got the last boat to Svalbard before the ice froze. In the pitch black of the Arctic night, they built this huge structure, this huge hangar, kind of trellises and canvas on the sides, concrete foundations, in the pitch black with a few lights, mostly handheld tools. Men who'd spent the whole life in the Mediterranean to house this huge airship. And it's worth pointing out, this is big aircraft. This is the size of an A380. The planes that the Germans and British and Americans were building, the airships the British, Americans, and Germans were building, were 3 times as big. Plans for even bigger ones. So we can't even imagine the size, of these machines. And if you're into all the business news about airships coming back, one of the problems they've got is no one's built airships this size for 80, 90 years. Next slide. So we forget, one of the things that drew me to the story is this amazing achievement that on May the, I was just getting the dates right. Yeah, on May the 11th, 1926, Norway sets off for the North Pole. About a day later, just under a day later, at 1:30 a.m. in the morning, they reach the North Pole. Then a couple of days later, they fly on to Alaska. And this is big news. 71-hour flight. This is New York Times. North safe in Alaska on a 71-hour flight. This is big news. So this was, if you carry on, could you flick on, please, Bex? This is about 3 full pages in the New York Times. And again, please. This is huge news, seen as one of the most amazing aeronautical achievements of this day, if not of all time. People thought at the time. We've totally forgotten it now. Tells you the nature of these things. And here we go. oh, okay, we moved on. So what you could have seen is when they got to Teller, they had to. The storms had been a terrible journey up to the North Pole. Had been easier, relatively easy from the North Pole to Alaska to Teller in Alaska. It had been terrible weather, and they're supposed to have gone on, but they had to put their ship down in the middle of nowhere. And basically, because there was no men, you need about 200, 150, 200 men to hold the airship down. You need a mast, tie it, and that was supposed to have been there at Norm, which is a bit kind of further on, but they had to crash in the wilderness. And basically, they jumped out of the airship and deflated it. And what had been this amazing ship turned into this kind of crumpled mass of girders and canvas, which is a sad end to a very amazing airship. And it's supposed to be shipped back to Italy, but not a single piece ever got back to Italy. I imagine all over Alaska, people's attics are probably bits of this airship, because it was an amazing feat that everyone was astonished by. So the first aircraft to fly from Norway over the North Pole to Alaska was an airship. People forget that. What I love, though, about this drawing, and this builds on to the cliffhanger I'm going to leave you with shortly as time's running on, is a sense of conflict between the men. So you have Amundsen on the right and Lincoln Ellsworth on the left, who's this millionaire now. We call him a billionaire probably today. Elon Musk type character probably. In one circle and nobody in the other circle. And you've got a real sense of the conflict between the men, because increasingly there was conflict between the men before the flight and on the flight, and especially afterwards. When Amundsen, who thought he was going to be the great hero when he got to America, who thought, this is going to be the big paycheck, but no one wanted to see him. They wanted to see, the American public wanted to see Umberto Nobile, who was called the new Columbus for his discoveries. Because after all, he was glamorous, he was younger, he'd built and flown the airship, whereas Amundsen, by all accounts, just sat in his chair. So he was the new hero. It wasn't the kind of classic explorers anymore. It was the aeronauts, and that's what was happening in the 20s. Aviation was the future, and people wanted to worship these aeronauts like they did kind of astronauts. So you got a real sense of the conflict between the two men. Nobody was mobbed by massive crowds. Amundsen was largely ignored. But it's important to remember behind this was Mussolini and a wonderful organization called the Fascist League of North America, who Mussolini's allies, and they were organizing the Italians. And lots of Italian migrants in America at the time would turn out and flock and surround Nobile, many more than Norwegians. So the popularity probably wasn't quite what it seemed, but certainly Mussolini won. This was seen as an Italian triumph, and Nobile was a hero. Amundsen left America in a really dark mood. We'd probably say he was depressed, locked himself away, and wrote this awful book slagging off everyone in his life, including Nobile. And that's where we ended after this amazing expedition. Next slide. So Nobile, almost the moment he lands back in Alaska in May 1926, he decides to return to the Arctic. And this is probably made more the case, especially, so he probably even wanted to go back even more when he got back to Italy. Because there were these two guys. So we've seen these guys earlier. You've got Mussolini on the right, Italia Balbo on the left. And it's a very different idea of their relationship. Mussolini's almost blushing. He's giving Italia Balbo his pilot's license, a really intimate moment. But nobody had done well out of the expedition to the North Pole and over the North Pole. He'd become a general. He got lots of sponsorship money. He'd become famous. He'd been even made an honorary member of the Fascist Party, even though he was kind of more or less opposed to fascism, although he was a patriot. And then he would come back and he discovered that he would never see Mussolini ever again alone. He used to have a special relationship with Mussolini. Now Balbo was there all the time, and Balbo really didn't like him. So I can imagine he'd had all this fame, all this wonder, he'd seen this amazing landscape in the Arctic. And it's not a surprise to me, after having been there myself, that he went, I just want to go back. Why put up with all the backbiting and fighting in Rome amongst all the kind of fascists who are out to get me, when I could escape back to the Arctic again. and that's what he decided to do. Mussolini actually warns him. It's a fateful encounter. Mussolini actually warns him and says perhaps it would be better not to tempt fate a second time to go back. And Nobili is insisting that he will. And then when Nobili leaves the room, Italia Balbo on the left apparently tells Mussolini, let him go, for he cannot possibly come back to bother us again. And it would appear very soon that Italia Balbo was in charge of Nobili's expedition, and he was playing perhaps a clever game. On the one hand, he was allowing it to happen. He didn't want to get in the way, perhaps, didn't in case it was successful, but also he was kind of undermining, you could argue he was undermining it underneath. And a very good example is Nobili says, can we take some seaplanes? The Italians had some amazing kind of seaplanes, state-of-the-art aircraft. Can I take 3 of them to the Arctic in case my airship crashes so it can be rescued? And Balbo says no. And if you want to convict Balbo for his crimes against Umberto Nobili, that's one of the main pieces of evidence. He doesn't allow these aircraft to go with Nobili to the North Pole. Next slide, please. So this time, Nobili sets off. We've almost get to the cliffhanger from Rome, and he decides rather than take this complicated route round Europe, he's going to go straight across to northern Germany, stop at an old Zeppelin base from the First World War, and then head straight to Svalbard. A tough journey for an airship of any size, and they have to get waylaid in Germany for a while, but they make it to Svalbard in early May 1928, which is the ideal flying time. And oh, okay, that's good. Some wonderful feedback. And they get to Svalbard, and he tries to do. He has a plans for about 5 or so flights, and he does. And yeah, let's see the next video. See whether. Do you think the video is going to work, Bex?
We can give it a go, but it might stop the PowerPoint again. Let's try the next one. Is it here?
Yeah.
Just from the start, Mark.
Yeah.
Let's see, shall we?
Oh, brilliant! So this is actual footage from the newsreels of Umberto's airship Italia in Svalbard, arriving in Svalbard. It's astonishing, and the other clips you've seen was as astonishing as this. So this is not fantasy. This is not Philip Pullman. This is not some fictional story. This actually happened, and the stock footage. So it's what they haven't shown in the newsreels. So you get a sense of the environment, and we get a sense of this amazing airship. That's Kings Bay as it comes into land. The antenna trading, and here you've got the miners ready to kind of hold it down. You need a lot of people to keep it tied down, and then that's. And here you go. This is one of the archetypal photographs of the Italia docking at the mast in Kings Bay, and some more detail. I mean, I could watch that for hours. Could you just go on one more slide before we finish? And that's tied up. It's astonishing footage. Yes. So he does this amazing flight. The tragedy about Umberto Nobili is he wants to shake off. He wants to show the Italians can explore the Arctic without the Norwegians and without the Americans. So he does this amazing flight on May the 15th, 1928, over 2,500 miles, 18,500 square miles, astonishing flight all the way along the Russian Siberian coast and back again. And it's far longer than the flight he did with Amundsen in 1926 to Alaska, and it's far harder feat because they have to come back to the starting point where they left. Whereas on the flight to Alaska, you can basically land anywhere once you've got there. So he has to navigate all the way back to exactly the same point where he left, which is an astonishing feat of achievement in 1928. An astonishing feat. And Norwegian journalists recognised it as that he did this on his own responsibility without any help. Astonishing feat. So the next flight, then, just one last slide. Sorry, don't move it back. Don't move it. So the next fleet then is going to fly to the North Pole. The flight to the North Pole should be the easy flight. It's only 500 miles or so from Kings Bay. He did it in 1926, the same design of airship. He did it in 1926. So it should be the easy one. And you're going to come back and you've done it for the newspapers, and then you can do perhaps some more exploring flights. So this is the photograph supposed to be the last photograph of Umberto Nobile uh, before they leave on this flight, learning to ski or skiing. The Norwegians thought Italian skiing was very funny, but they do ski in Italy, so perhaps that was unfair. This is supposed to be his last photograph, which I find is quite haunting because he's almost looking directly past this guy at us. So next slide, please. Next slide, please, Rex. Just two more. So this is New York Times headline, a page of the day that they reached the North Pole. You can't really see it, but it's in there. So next slide. After that, I just want to show you, get a sense of it. It's an important story. It's still on the front page, perhaps not as big as 1926, but there we go. Nobile drops the cross and flags at the pole. So it's still good, it's still big news, not as big as 1926, but you can see that Nobile is still a celebrity. We totally forgotten about him, but he's still a celebrity. So they reached the North Pole, and then they have to come back. The weather hasn't been good, and they're being blown along by the storm. But they know that if they turn back and follow the route they've come, they're going to fly straight into the storm. If they have another option of going back to Canada, flying on to Canada or America, but again, the Italia would meet the same fate as the Norge, would just be wrecked. And there'll be heroes, but they've done this flight already, and there'll be no airship. There are no more expeditions. Or he had another choice of going a really long route back, perhaps far north and back round via Siberia to catch the air currents, a very long route, but would avoid a storm. Or he could fly back the way he came into the storm in the belief that the storm would be over. Now, a fateful thing occurs. Malgren, his Swedish navigator, convinces him that the storm is going to break and that the easiest and the best way is to fly straight back to Kings Bay, which is what they do. And this is obviously straight into a storm. And on May the 25th, the Italia crashes, disappears to begin with. And no one knows what's happened. And they have to launch this huge rescue mission, the Arctic's greatest rescue mission to find it. If your next slide, please. And obviously there's no cameras there to picture it, but this is what kind of magazine illustrators imagined occurred, and we and basically got this idea that tail hit the ice first, the gondola is ripped off, and the tragedy of the situation is that you can see one guy falling out. Is about half the crew were left on the ice of the ruined gondola, and the other half floated away in the airship. Next slide, please. And this is another illustration from a bit later, I think in the 50s or 60s, another view of what happened to as well. And the fate of the men, obviously, fate of the men who floated away have never been found. Brilliant. So, just wonder whether we can squeeze a couple more in. So they're stuck on the ice. Next slide. This is how Hollywood imagined it, about set in Antarctica. Due to the weather in Antarctica, I don't think there's ever been an airship there, but this is how they imagined it. You can find this on YouTube if you want to. Some people like it. I find it a bit old-fashioned. The Lost Zeppelin. Next slide. We won't try this one. Carry on. But again, it shows you the importance, of the Pathé News for paying for this all. This is all paid for. And one of the cruel ironies and all these things in Nobody's contract was, if he disappears, and obviously reappears, if he disappears for 2 or 3 days, the Italia disappears for 2 or 3 days, and then reappears, he gets more money. So this is the contradiction in all these things. Why Amundsen perhaps has tended to disappear. They get more money in the media rights. It's worth a lot more to the media companies. So the last slide or two. So Amundsen decides, Amundsen, hold it there for a second. Amundsen decides he's going to be magnanimous at this great dinner in Oslo. He agrees to come and he says, I will go, when they're looking for volunteers to search for Nobile. Everyone knows he hates the man. But no one really wants anything to do with him because he's criticized them. He's unpredictable. Everything he touches, it turns out to be very expensive. So he persuades some French government to lend him this seaplane, and here he is. This is probably the last time he's seen in late May, no, sorry, early June 1928. He's about to fly from Tromsø to Kings Bay in Svalbard to join the search for Nobly, or is it? Or is he keeps his plans very close to himself? Doesn't tell anyone. Perhaps kind of hangover from beating Scott to the South Pole. He keeps everything to himself. So here he is on his plane, about to set off. People have been a bit worried about him. He said some kind of alarming things, especially in retrospect. And then he takes off and then flies it. There's last seen by a fisherman flying into a bank of cloud, and the plane is never seen again. Do you want to, last slide? Slide 2. Faint SOS signals heard by 2 ships, maybe Amundsen's. New hope is aroused. Then the next slide. Amundsen's friend believes him dead. So Ellsworth, so let's link at Ellsworth, back from the 1925-26 plane, decides to offer him aid. So at this point, then, in early mid-June 1928, Nobly and the crew of the Italia have disappeared, and Amundsen has disappeared, and you've got this huge, the Arctic biggest ever search and rescue mission going on, with people pushing these really primitive planes to the limits of their operation to try and look for these people. Next slide. So what's going to happen? So you need to buy the book to find out, obviously. I have to leave it on the cliffhanger, but I just thought we'd show you this picture today. This is Kings Bay today. The hangar's gone, that great hangar's gone, although you'll find some kind of concrete foundations. And this is the airship mast that we saw in that footage, black and white film. It still stands today. And there's a new breed of airship entrepreneur promising to fly passengers from Svalbard to the North Pole in luxury airships next year. So we'll see what happens. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. That was...
It was a bit longer. I didn't notice the time. Sorry.
That's okay. No worries at all. Yeah, thank you so much for that. I have a couple of questions just to do a quick Q&A with you. I don't know whether any questions have come in on the chat, but I will just have a quick look at that. But if anybody else, any of our residents or any of our teams watching would like to put through any questions, either on the comments on YouTube or the chat on Zoom, that'd be amazing. We do have one from B, who I think is Kerno House, and she has asked, how many people can travel in an airship and what is actually inside it?
That's a perfect question. I was hoping someone was going to ask this. In Amundsen's airships, you could get probably 16 to 20 people, and they had a kind of a cabin that was attached to underneath the airship, and then they had some storage area in the envelope itself, and then actually when it crashed, some of the people were asleep in the envelope in the tail of the plane, and then inside the envelope is the lifting gas. In this time, it was often hydrogen, which was obviously very flammable. So that's why you need a huge envelope to have enough gas to lift this weight. In the big airships, I talk about in the book, and I talked about then, which were 3 times the size, you'd have the gondola underneath, but most of the passenger compartments, and they were designed to take passengers, would be inside the envelope. So you had this kind of thick rubber seal between them and this incredibly explosive gas, and you would have restaurants, bar rooms. You'd have a kind of veranda that you could look over the side of the airship. And then remember, the airships flew quite low, so you'd see whales and dolphins and liners. And then you'd have restaurants, bars, bedrooms. The first electric oven, I believe, and one of your residents probably knows better, was designed for the Graf Zeppelin, because people wanted these wonderful meals. And of course, you couldn't have gas, in a hydrogen airship. So, and there's some great menus and some great cocktails. And there was lots of tension between the American and the German passengers. The Germans wanted meat and beer, and the Americans wanted lighter food and gin and tonics and cocktails.
I love that.
So they had about 100 people. They could carry, I think, the airships that were built could carry about 60 to 70 people. But they were planning on airships that could carry 100. 100 plus, which would be even bigger.
Amazing. Wow. There's a really interesting section in the book actually about kind of, you go into detail about the different types of airships and like rigid and semi-rigid ones, which I was found fascinating. And maybe you'll explain it a bit later in the book. I haven't quite finished it yet. But what happened to airships? Because I think when I was looking at those images, I don't know if our residents can remember like whether airships are around. I don't know when they kind of went out of production, but they look almost fake to me because obviously we've never seen them with our eyes. So yeah, can you tell us a bit about what happened to airships and why they stopped being around, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a brilliant question. So the one answer is that they never stopped being around. They just became this really small niche, like the Goodyear blimp that you see on the kind of the Super Bowl or over London Olympics in 2012. People thought it was a UFO, but it was the Goodyear blimp. So you had a few airships like that still being built for marketing and that kind of thing, but very small numbers. But basically what happened was, people often say, oh, the Hindenburg, huge German airship, crashed in 1938, 37 in flames in front of the world's cameras.
Wow.
And that was the end of the airship, because why would anyone want to fly in an airship in a craft if it was going to do that?
Yeah.
And that seemed to coincide with the end of this golden age of these huge airships. And there have been a number of other big crashes as well, often by people pushing the technology too fast, especially British and Americans. The Germans had an amazing record, and they had a commercial airship service to South America for years, and no one died. So it's a bit of a tragedy that this spectacular thing happened.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that was a big problem. And the switch to helium, which was safe gas, would have been good, but the Americans controlled all the helium supplies, and they weren't going to give it to the Nazis. So you had all sorts of things like this, which meant those big airships faded away. No one wanted to build them. Actually, the last flight, really, everyone forgets this, was in 1940, and the last German Zeppelin, so it's this new class of huge Zeppelin, flew around Britain just before the Battle of Britain. People forget this, trying to measure and identify British radar towers. What was this thing that we had? And it was flying up and down, just outside the British territorial waters before the war really started. So at some point there must have been a Hurricane or Spitfire must have come along and looked at this huge aircraft. I would love that must have happened. So that was the last of these huge mammoth airships. I mean, the German design fell out with the Hitler, so that was the end anyway. But the Americans carried on using airships. The Americans used hundreds of small airships called blimps during the war to hunt submarines, and they carried on using those to the 1960s in large numbers. So we've forgotten that.
Wow. Okay. One of our homes, Ashminster House, had said that their residents were reminiscing together whilst you were talking about the Goodyear airship.
Yes.
So, just on that note, if any other residents maybe have memories, I presume from when you were children, about airships or anything like that, it would be lovely to know. So do get that in the chat, and we can tell Mark about it as well. So do you think, I know you just said that there's something happening with airships next year. So do you think that there's ever because you also mentioned that they were used commercially, do you hope that they'll come back into kind of like commercial use?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, I think there's at least three different companies who are serious about this.
Really?
Including one of the founders of Google in America. So they're investing quite a lot of money. I think there's the desire for green, non-polluting aviation is behind a lot of this. And shipping stuff so it doesn't take as much carbon. So I think there's a real demand for it now. I mean, I think the biggest problem is just the engineering challenges. I mean, these are huge machines. No one's built anything like it for 90 years. So you're relearning the techniques. And I spoke to one of the scientists, one of the engineers who's working on this American airship program called the LTA Research, and he was saying how a lot of the science these engineers pioneered in the 20s and 30s they're still using it today.
Really? Wow.
Yes. So the materials are better, but some of the science and behind it,
hasn't progressed. Yeah. Wow, that is fascinating. I kind of hope they come back. They're really cool. So there was also, I was kind of thinking whilst you were talking about Amundsen,
Yeah.
and he seems like a very risky guy. He's taking a lot of risks. So I was just interested in your kind of opinion on him, and obviously him as this great explorer, but also that kind of risky behavior, and that he did achieve so much, and whilst also not living for the longest time. So yeah, what do you kind of think about him?
Okay, that's brilliant. What do I think about him? I mean, he achieved so much, but he's obviously not a nice guy. I mean, he's good, you know. I think I suppose I don't know whether you have to say allegedly. Allegedly, he drove one of his men to suicide who dared to threaten him on their expedition to Antarctica,
Oh,
who dared to
yeah.
challenge him. Afterwards, he drove him apparently to suicide. So he's a ruthless. You know, he could have told Scott about his doubts about using some of these machines to get to the South Pole, but he didn't.
Mhm.
So he's a ruthless guy, not a very nice guy. But then, I mean, I don't think you could be to achieve what he achieved in those conditions. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think the risk. I think one of the biggest things that I've discovered writing this book is, in many ways, this world is familiar to us, and the media, the newspapers, the popularism, and
Yeah.
these kind of leaders. It's a very similar world we live in. But one world that's so different is the attitude to risk.
Yeah.
That they didn't test fly these planes in the Arctic, and they would just get in them and just fly. I mean, it's just astonishing. I don't know whether that people said. I thought perhaps it's because lots of people died young from diseases, so perhaps you have a very different attitude to risk. Uh,
Yeah.
and or it could be another person said quite rightly, the Great War. They'd seen so many people killed around them.
Mhm.
Perhaps you just change your view of what your life's worth in that situation.
Yeah. So do you think that there wouldn't one of my colleagues was messaging me listening to your talk and was wondering whether the same kind of thing wouldn't happen today and there wouldn't be another Amundsen because there's all these kind of health and safety regulations and having to be a bit more careful. So do you think that someone could achieve the same things as him without having taken that many risks? Do
Oh
you think
well,
he
I
would
think
have?
that is a fantastic question. I mean, uh, I think that's a really good question, and it gets quite controversial. I mean, Elon Musk is a very controversial figure, but what he's achieved, say, in his space program, I'm not going to talk about his other things. In the space program, it was amazing, and that was done by pushing people. People work very long hours in a way that perhaps people on the outside makes us all feel really uncomfortable. But I certainly talked to people who worked for him on the SpaceX,
Yeah,
and they loved it because
right.
they achieved things that no one thought was possible. The idea a rocket could come back from space and land on its legs. These are amazing engineering achievements. So I think can do. I mean, I'm not. I think it may challenge some of our thinking because you have to be able to take more risk, I guess.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah, it's like an expedition to Mars. I mean, by inherently it's risky. So
yeah.
I'm not sure. I hope so. I hope so.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Sally, I'm not sure which home she's from, but she said one of her residents is reminiscing about her father and his knowledge. I presume kind of,
Yeah.
oh, they're from Lockdoor. And I don't know, Sally, if you've got any more information about what the resident's father
So
knew
that's
about
great.
the
There's many people, think about,
yeah,
reminisce.
and can
Fantastic.
remember it. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'll just ask you a couple more
Yeah,
questions.
cool.
What's your favorite part of the kind of whole story? Is there a bit that particularly interests you the most?
Oh
Um,
wow, you're asking some really good questions. I mean, well, my favorite part of the story. I mean, some things that didn't make it in the book, like what some of the characters, like Richard Bird, who appears in the book and early on, what they get up to in Antarctica, because they play a key role in opening up Antarctica and exploring Antarctica. So it's not the foot explorers like Scott and Amundsen who explore Antarctica. Antarctica is the aeronauts, is the aviators who do. So I think that's really nice. And I thought it was quite fascinated by the stuff that nobody got up to in Russia, in Stalin's Russia. And there's a lot I couldn't include. because by then we were running out of space. And then, you know, so he got up to lots of adventures in Stalin's Russia, and somehow survived. But not so. I was just reading the other day about how many British and American engineers who went over to work for Stalin ended up disappearing into the gulags. But somehow nobody went there. Went to the Kremlin hospital when he got ill, and then it came back. So that makes you, I don't know, it makes you think a little bit about what was going on there. So
how to come back. Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I loved the bit that I've loved reading the book so far is, if you kind of touched on it in your presentation, was when they did, I think it was Mobile crashed, or maybe Amazon crashed, and then they had to create a runway from the ice, but they only had a very limited amount of fuel, and the fuel wouldn't only go so far because they fit people from 2 planes into one, and they took, was it the 6th go they took turning over?
They took 6 goes and then had 1 left.
And they'd have had something like half the rations, and they'd managed to create a runway from ice, take off 5 times, trying on the 6th. And the amount of, you know, how strong you have to be mentally as a person to keep trying to do that, and to keep the hope of surviving, was just fascinating to me.
I mean, a lot I didn't include, because Lincoln Aylesworth wrote about that, and because they were taking shelter in the fuselage of one of the planes, and you can see the kind of ice forming on the inside of the metal. And they say that even Amundsen, apparently, said he aged, even though he's used to toughest conditions. This must be one of the toughest things he'd experienced, because although he loved it, this is what he did, he aged because it's so tough and terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. It's crazy to think of. It's crazy to imagine. And I guess my last question is, obviously this is your first book. You said that you got that review, was it in Wall Street Journal? Yeah, which is amazing. So I guess, just as an author, are you proud of your accomplishment? Was it worth the effort that went into, no doubt, researching everything and writing it?
Well, my wife would probably say no, it wasn't. Disrupted holidays and the I think it was. I think looking back, because it's been so well received as well. I mean, the reviews have all been fantastic, and the readers seem to mostly love it. That's made it incredibly worthwhile. You know, and you obviously go back and think, I wish I'd done this differently. But I think given the time, it's my first book, I think, I'm happy with it. Yeah.
Good, amazing. Well, like I said, I love it, and I can't wait to continue reading it. I've read it on the way to and from the office every day.
That's brilliant. You're the perfect reader, Bex.
Yeah, it's good. And I've also loved, just for our residents at home, it's been really fascinating for me listening to you talk, Mark, having the context of kind of already have read the book. So obviously, to our homes, you've now got access to Amazon Business. So if you did want to buy Mark's book through Amazon and turn it into a book club, and then potentially rewatch the event again and find out what's extra on the from the book that you haven't got, that will be in the presentation. So yes, thank you so much, Mark, to really illustrate the book, and would really encourage all of our homes to buy it if you're interested in reading it. We've got some lovely comments coming in, Mark. I don't know if you can see it at the bottom, but so Kingsland House have said, thank you, we've really enjoyed for this afternoon, and it's got everyone reminiscing. Kathy from Bloomfield has said it's been a great afternoon, thank you. B from Kerno has said that they love historic talks, so thank you very much, Mark. Which is just
the whole country. That's really lovely. Thank you.
Well, up and down. But yes, it's lovely. So thank you very much, Mark, for coming in and talking to us today. Thank you to everyone who's joined us. I hope you've enjoyed finding out about the story as much as I have. And yes, have a lovely afternoon. Thanks again, Mark.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure, Bex.